I'm going to introduce today's speakers. I'm going to start with Anna Fahey. Anna Fahey is the Principal Director of Strategy Lead Sightline Institute, communications, marketing, and messaging strategies, coordinates the organization's cross-cutting legislative campaigns, and serves on Sightline's executive team. Anna regularly partners with the brain trust of national and regional partners to develop persuasive narratives and guidance for communicating about public policy solutions, from climate and energy to election systems to housing and land use. She holds a BA from Smith College and a master's from the University of Washington. Back in Anacortes, Washington, where she grew up, Anna lives just a short dog walk with the kids, if she's lucky, to a favorite Puget Sound beach. She's going to leave her email at the end. And now I'm going to introduce Jamal. Jamal Raad is a co-founder and executive director of Evergreen Action, a group which helped design and pass the climate provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest federal climate investment
He's
in
pretty
America.
old. Oops.
Uh, Thanks, Mike. And Jamal has dedicated his life to fighting for progressive change from the inside on Capitol Hill and on political campaigns across the country. He has served as press secretary for U.S. Senator Jeff Merkley. Most recently, Jamal ran communications for Washington Governor Jay Inslee's presidential campaign, which was a grassroots movement to put climate change at the top of the national agenda. And now I'm going to introduce Daniel Herriges. Daniel Herriges is the policy director at the Parking Reform Network, where he works with our partner organizations to accelerate critical parking reforms through education, organizing, coalition building, and direct advocacy. Prior to coming to PRN, Daniel was editor-in-chief at Strong Towns, and he is the co-author of the book Escaping the Housing Trap. Daniel has a master's in urban planning from the University of Minnesota. He lives in St. Paul, Minnesota. Okay, with this all said, please give a big applause to today's speakers and give them a warm welcome. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Hi, my name's Jamal Raad. Thank you so much for attending this briefing. As mentioned in the bio, I worked in communications on the Hill for Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon, later in Seattle for Governor Jay Inslee in Washington. I co-founded and ran Evergreen Action, a former executive director, climate change policy and advocacy shop that played a role in shaping and passing the Inflation Reduction Act. But most importantly, I'm a proud founding board member of the Welcoming Neighbors Network. Welcoming Neighbors Network is leading diverse coalitions that bring together rural conservatives, urban progressives, business and labor, and more. They share best practices, invest in key state and local housing fights, and provide technical and campaign support for pro-housing community groups looking to grow and become more effective. I'm proud that WNN members are the advocates behind most major state and city pro-housing policy victories over the past 5 years, from incredible progress in red states like Montana and Texas to blue states like Washington and California. I just want to say it's great to be in the same Zoom room with so many folks who are working every day to improve their communities. Today, we are here to talk about parking and why parking policy matters. As many, if not most, of the folks in this room know, parking policy is a set of regulations and city codes that just about nobody thinks about, but has a surprisingly big influence on our communities and our environment. It's a hidden force that shapes our lives. Since the 50s and 60s, pretty much every new building and business and home has been required to build a predetermined number of parking spots, no matter what, need it or not. What that means is in most cities, parking is systematically overbuilt by law. That costs us space, that costs us money, and we all pay the price. We engaged in public and elite opinion research late last year in conjunction with Sightline Institute on how to talk about housing in a way that connects with people. That led to a pro-homes messaging guidance that we released earlier this year that I think Carrick can put in the chat. At the same time, we also did a significant amount of research on how to talk about parking, so much so that we decided to break those learnings away from the overall housing research. And that's what we will be presenting to you all today. Perhaps some of this will look familiar. Anna at Sightline gave some preliminary thoughts on these findings to the Parking Reform Network, I believe, in a webinar in August. This is a more fleshed out vision of the work that Anna's already presented some of to you all. This parking messaging guidance is built off of both qualitative and quantitative public research, tested messages in multiple rounds over 3 national polls, and many more online and in-person focus groups, as well as the learned lessons of many significant victories across the country in parking. I helped co-lead the development of this research alongside our other presenters today, and I will then pass it along to Daniel to start the presentation.
Thanks, Jamal. So as Jamal mentioned already, parking has really kind of surprising wide-ranging impacts. If you're all at a PRN webinar, this is not surprising to you, but to most people it is. I've heard parking policy described as kind of the dark matter, of the urban framework that affects everything, but that people don't think about. Um, and because people don't think about either the costs of existing parking policies or the opportunities inherent in changing it, we have an incredible opportunity as advocates and as communicators. Most people don't have really fully formed opinions about parking policy. It's not something that is coded in people's minds as a deeply partisan or ideological thing. And so people really across the demographic and political spectrum are open to persuasion with the right messaging. So that's really the impetus for this guide, is to figure out what resonates and what helps shift people's opinions toward our policy priorities. Um, and really what we found was that, this is an issue. We can talk about this issue and we can persuade people. And the way we do it is by making clear the harms occurring under today's rules, under today's parking mandates, and contrasting that with the flexibility that we create when we remove those requirements. The emphasis on flexibility is a core piece of the messaging advice you're going to hear today, because it sidesteps some of the more zero-sum framings of the debate that you might hear. And we'll talk a little more in depth about that later, but in favor of a simple message, which is that there are good things we want in our communities that can only happen if you take away parking as a reason people can't do them. So yeah, PRN, Sightline, and Welcoming Neighbors helped shape the messages that we tested in this research through our on-the-ground experience with a lot of successful campaigns. That really provided a set of initial hypotheses. What are the things we're already saying? And then let's test these messages broadly and find out what really resonates with people. And there are a lot of successful campaigns to draw on, because although this seems like a difficult issue to get the public to care about, parking reform has momentum. And it has momentum in a really startling variety of places. Red states, blue states, big cities, small towns, suburbs, rural areas, central cities. Really, really astonishing diversity in terms of the sorts of places and the sorts of demographics that have embraced this reform. And we see that reflected in this map. Some of the data here, if you're a PRN member, you probably know is drawn from our parking reform map, which that link should be appearing in the chat. But, municipal level parking reforms, we track there. We know of over 100 in the US alone, cities that have completely abolished off-street parking mandates for all uses. And then statewide reform is growing rapidly, especially in the last couple of years. We now have more than 10 states that have passed parking-related legislation that has created more parking flexibility. The most recent being really, really landmark victories in states like Washington and Connecticut this year, rolling back a lot of these requirements. And so this is really the core of the framework that we developed. When we took the messaging research, some of the insights that were coming out of it, and thought, okay, how can we turn this into a guide that is practical for communicators to use on this issue, and package a lot of the messages that we found were most successful into a framework. And so what we landed on was a 3-part framework, where first what we do is we have to show people the problem. We have to show people what are the actual concrete harms that are happening now. What are the things that we're prevented from having in our communities, from housing that isn't built, housing that is more expensive than it should be, the inability to open or expand a business or a necessary community amenity like childcare, the loss of green space in our communities because of requirements for excess asphalt. And consistently, what we found is the top performing messages framed that problem in terms of waste and in terms of costs, things that were costing the community, that were making their life more expensive and making their quality of life worse. And then part two of the framework, having shown people the problem, is we illustrate what can happen when we solve the problem. We give them a positive vision of a solution. Um, when we remove parking mandates, what are the ways in which the community benefits? What are the things that we can have because of parking flexibility? And the key here is to frame that solution in really concrete, relatable ways for people, in terms of people in the community and places that people care about, or the kinds of places that they would like to see. The top performing messages consistently are the ones that did that. And then finally, be clear about the action that needs to be taken. And the action is to remove arbitrary and harmful mandates and thereby create parking flexibility, and emphasize who should be the decision makers. We found that overwhelmingly, the people in our survey were persuaded by the idea that the people who know best how much parking they should have are the property owners, are the builders of needed new homes, are the people trying to start locally owned businesses. Um, we saw broad agreement with the notion that these people are credible, as opposed to the idea that a bureaucratic mandate can tell you how much parking you need. So to go a little bit more in depth into each of these three steps of constructing a compelling message here. Step one, define the problem in terms of waste and costs. People don't know. This is something we drill home again and again at PRN. People don't know how expensive parking is to build and maintain. People don't know how much it costs them in their lives, and people don't know the things that are being prevented by the policies already on the books. Um, and we think that was reflected in the fact that we saw these messages that illustrated and dramatized those harms. As like pretty much all of these messages across the board, when people were presented with them, it did shift their support towards being more favorable toward parking reform. Um, and so using specific examples is really, really powerful here. Um, Talk about housing costs. Each parking spot can raise your rent for your apartment by hundreds of dollars per month, whether you're using that parking or not. Because that's the construction cost. That's money that has to be paid by someone for every parking space that is built. Um, the loss of new housing because there isn't physical room to build it because parking is crowding it out. Talking about the concrete and specific impacts of having too much asphalt on the ground. It traps heat, dangerously high temperatures threaten people's health. Connecting the dots for people to things that are going to happen to them that they're not going to like, as opposed to saying, contribute to urban heat island effects. Your health is going to suffer because of high temperatures, because of all this asphalt around you. Trees need to be cut down. One of the highest performing messages across demographic categories had to do with the loss of trees and green space in the community to accommodate more parking, and then local businesses. Um, when we illustrate the solution, what we find is if you can show people what are the things that you're trading away in order to have more parking, in order to have guaranteed, parking through parking mandates. If you frame that as a trade-off, majorities of people clearly prefer more community benefits over more parking. Um, and so we highlight solutions that move the conversation away from a zero-sum argument about how much parking should we need? Should we have more parking or less parking? And instead frame it as a trade-off between parking mandates, between excess parking and community benefits, such as more home options, options for certain categories of housing. Can seniors downsize? Can they age in place? Can young families find starter homes that are appropriate for them? Excuse me. Main Street type rhetoric was very compelling to large numbers of people in our sample. So emphasizing thriving main streets, walkable places, revitalized downtown shopping streets, local services, childcare, People-friendly neighborhoods with parks and tree-lined streets to stroll with the dog or kids. Paint that picture for people. Um, and you can see over on the right here, like when you actually frame it as a trade-off, really, really strong majorities support the things that parking reform can unlock. Um, and going back to, again, flexibility as a key theme here. The core message here is that parking mandates are wasteful and they are costly. And what we need instead is to restore the flexibility to the property owner to make a context by context decision about how much parking they actually want to provide. Um, that sidesteps the tendency for this debate to get mired in, well, how much parking is right? And should we dial it up or should we dial it down? Um, and you don't get caught then trying to disprove, to fight on your opponent's turf, to disprove the notion that we're going to have a parking shortage. Instead, we're framing it as flexibility versus rigidity, flexibility versus arbitrary mandates, um, and emphasizing that actual parking needs vary too widely for these arbitrary codes to be appropriate for dictating them. Um, the flexibility narrative was really, really powerful in our survey. Um, and Anna will talk a little bit more in a minute about how that actually is a subtle but important departure from the ways we have seen lots of advocates talking about this issue in the past. Um, Before I turn it over, here's just a quick kind of example of actually walking through that three-step message. This one happens to be with regard to local businesses. So first, we're going to frame the problem, illustrate the waste. When we force locally owned businesses and services to build big, expensive parking lots, especially if they're in an older storefront or on a smaller lot, it prevents them from opening. It drives them out of town. It forces them to take their business out to the suburbs, something like that. And these small local businesses, we want them. That's the positive vision. They are the heart of our community. They bring people together and they create vibrant neighborhoods. And so, what should we do? We should drop the wasteful parking mandate and allow the flexibility for that business owner, that property owner, to determine what is going to meet their needs. And that is going to allow more local businesses to open and succeed. So you can see the structure of that three-part framework. All right. I am now going to hand it over to Anna to share some tips about, applying this with a little bit more nuance.
Thanks, Daniel. And thanks to all the PRN folks here today. You all are the ones who are out there in the field doing this work and helping inform the messaging that we tested, and now in a position to go out to further populate that map that Daniel showed, and further road testing this guidance. So we're excited to be presenting this. I did talk about the early sort of my first impressions of the work back in August. And so we're thrilled now to be rolling out this fully fledged framework for you all. So as Daniel said, I'm going to walk through a handful of additional tips and recommendations to help us keep to our best performing language and frames. And first up is that when we talk about parking policy, we really are more effective if we shift the focus onto convenience and connection and shift it away from messages about car dependence. And I'll talk about why. This is obviously sort of a significant shift. Lots of parking reform campaigners tend to lead with sort of what you might call anti-car frames. And of course, this works really well, like in this room, right? We all get it. And it works for some of our diehard urbanist audiences. But one thing that we found in the research that marks the sort of shift in how we recommend talking about parking reform is to generally avoid these car-centric messages as kind of our main focus or our leading frame. So if we want to win people over, people who, like Daniel said, have not thought about this very much, don't see that dark force and how it shapes their lives and makes their rent go up, we don't want to lead with messages about driving less, about mode shift, about car dependence, or even necessarily like terms like car storage. So there are a couple reasons for this. For one, these messages test pretty badly. critiques of car culture and driving do not perform well. And it's hard to say why, but we can imagine people feel really locked into this. Most people have to drive, and so it triggers like a defensive response. These messages also tend to paint us into a corner where we're inadvertently making the case that is often used by our opposition that parking reform really only works where you already have ample, robust transit or other non-driving options. And we don't want to get into that argument. But the biggest reason is that what we found, and this came out really strongly in the qualitative work in the focus group testing, is that when we talk about parking, people tend to default to a car frame, a driver mode, essentially. So for most people, when you bring up parking, their default is to sort of be a driver. Even when we showed them, I think I may have mentioned this in August, but when we showed them those classic sort of parking ratio images where there's like no parking and a nice tree-lined street, and then there's like all the way up to a drive-through, essentially, people tend to see those and evaluate them as drivers. And when you're in that mode, you basically want more parking, not less, right? People already don't perceive that there's an oversupply of parking or that we're forcing overbuilt parking. So when you say car storage, they say, yep, I want more of it. And so to be receptive to what we're proposing, we need their heads to be in more of a community member mode, not that driver mode. So we want the messages we use to more consistently toggle them from that driver thinking over to community thinking, which the research shows, like Daniel pointed out, like they're already really ready and willing to do. Like if we ask them the things that they'd prefer or what they would prioritize over more paved parking spaces, those other things win every time. So even if, like, as advocates, one of our primary end goals is to reduce emissions and congestion from driving and to get more transit use. The rule of thumb here really is that in our word choices and our narrative framing of this issue, we want to be able to switch people from where will I park as sort of their central driving response to what is it like to live here? What do I want more of in my neighborhood? What is the kind of place I want to live? And how do these policies impact that? It's not that we never ever want to talk about cars or about car dependence. Sometimes it's really helpful to point out different groups and car ownership and some things like that, but that's going to be down the line, not your opening gambit. And know that if we want to change hearts and minds, it's just better to focus on the kinds of places and how people exist in those places than getting us out of our cars. All right, next tip. This is an important one. This may resonate with folks who've been out in the trenches working on this issue. We want to focus on current real-time harms that impact people right now. Conjecture about what may happen if parking rules change is super unproductive for us. People tend to go to more traffic and sort of parking doom scenarios. And opponents of parking reform consistently leverage this, right? They raise the what if scenarios. And again, on the flip side, we know that from the research that most people don't yet have much information about the current costs. So our job is to show that over and over again, right? To make the connection between rent and prices and lost local business opportunities, and how this is shaping the built environment. These are current day price tags and costs that we're all paying now. And this is an opportunity for us as messengers. We want to weight current actual harms above those or heavier than those scare tactics. And the guidance here is to just redirect the conversation from abstract fears about what might happen to these specific local examples of harm from the status quo today, right now, and that we have policy fixes to help undo those harms if we switch to flexibility. And just one quick added note to illustrate this and really bring it home. It's good to call out real local examples of businesses and services and things local people want. A message that tested really well was about plans for a local daycare center that never got off the ground because of these wasteful mandates, driving up the cost, taking up too much space on the proposed lot. All right, tip 3. We want to connect parking mandates to affordability. We know from every recent public opinion survey just about everywhere across the country that affordability is top of mind for voters right now. But again, people don't necessarily make the connection readily to obscure local building regulations about parking, right? So our job is to underscore that these blanket parking mandates lead to real costs in people's everyday lives right now. Again, current harms. And we want to link parking reform with the housing shortage. So voters want more homes that they can afford, and people who work in their communities can afford. They can see that there's a shortage of options. They want solutions. And I'll invite you all to see our complimentary messaging guidance on the Pro Homes framework for how to talk about shortage and affordability choices more specifically. The point here is, though, that when we give people a choice, voters overwhelmingly say that they want more homes over more parking. 87% agreed with this in our survey. So we should forefront housing costs and rent as a problem that wasteful mandates make worse. And it's good to be very direct and specific about costs passed on to renters and home buyers. As one example, in our testing, saying $200 is added monthly to rent is far more powerful by like 20 points in our survey than saying each stall costs $5,000 to $60,000 to build. That's a message that we use a lot. It's not like you can never say that. It's just better to make that cost more specific, a dollar figure that people can imagine themselves or someone they know paying. It takes that sort of abstract, construction costs message and makes it a kitchen table question that people can relate to. And I'll add that a key piece of our Pro Homes narrative framework was around competition. So in the housing shortage frame, competition for housing driving up prices. This works well here too, and an argument that parking mandates cause cutthroat competition in the housing market was especially convincing to Black and rural voters. All right, 4th tip, use visuals. Parking reform, as with most zoning and regulatory policy issues, is abstract, it's hidden, it's unfamiliar. So it can be difficult for people to connect to it sort of on an emotional level. So what we want to do is use vivid language and photography when we can to really put the picture in people's mind of big empty parking lots, acres of asphalt, and that familiar, ubiquitous, inhospitable strip mall development in the sprawly parts of town that people experience and that's very familiar in people's minds in communities across the country. So we want to really evoke and describe that feeling of sort of urban neglect and decay and empty paved spaces. And then contrast it with the opposite, right? Like what you get when we make this change or what you protect when we make this change. The vibrant main streets, the unique downtowns, connected, inviting neighborhoods, village squares, and really show people out and about and enjoying those places. And as with much of this framework, It's better to focus again on real local examples than to stay at the level of abstraction. So it's better to show a map as another example of how much space is used for parking in a particular city versus just saying what percentage, like 25 or 30%, which again is more abstract, and you want to take it to the local, the real, and the visual. All right. Tip number 5, Daniel touched on this a little bit. We want to emphasize how people really see and feel the local environmental harms. So tangible, local, concrete, and real when it comes to environmental arguments for parking reform. People respond most powerfully to these harms that, again, as Daniel said, people that like impacts them physically in a way. Stormwater pollution in local waterways, dangerous temperatures because of asphalt trapping heat, loss of local trees, making way for pavement, and sprawling development and how it drives up local traffic and local air pollution. These harms are more persuasive in the testing than more abstract appeals, for example, about global climate impacts. And as noted, trees win over everything. Trees are a top testing reason for reform, and this was true even among the consistent parking flexibility cynics in the research. So they wanted the trees, even though they never, throughout a survey, never opted to support the policy change. So I would just say to use this one wisely. There's obviously a sort of NIMBY argument when it comes to the supremacy of trees over housing or any kind of zoning reform. But with parking, we really want to zero in on this idea that when we force pavement, more pavement than we need, when we overbuild parking by law, that means that we cut down trees for no real reason, right? So it's that back to that trade-off. We've written this trade-off into law, but we don't need to. It's a really good illustration overall of sort of the waste frame and what we lose in that transaction. Basically also that we can have more nice things, right? If we change this. In campaigns, people often raise fears about potential traffic problems if we change parking rules. And when we talk about local familiar harms that are happening now, there's a way to sort of turn this on its head. Basically, a current harm that people experience in the here and now is also the sprawling development and the traffic that it causes. People are already dealing with this because of those development patterns. We don't have to do it this way. We can choose safer, healthier, and more connected places. All right, and the last tip, we want to position local home builders, property owners, and business people as the ones who know best what amount of parking makes sense for a specific building, site, location, their residents, their customers. Nearly 3/4 of voters believe that parking rules should be flexible to suit a specific location, site, and use. This feels like common sense to the folks that we tested messages with. And of course, there's always a lingering hint of skepticism about developers cutting corners or, going for profit. We've seen this before, typically everywhere in the housing policy space. But respondents in our surveys also get it, that it's the builders and businesses who know best what amount of parking is going to be right for their site and what they need to build to be successful. So ideally in this space, you want to get real local people with a compelling story to help illustrate this or to be the messengers about it. A friendly cafe owner who wanted to expand, but if they added more tables, it would prompt a bunch more parking spots that they didn't have room for or that would just sit empty. a small local contractor trying to make a fourplex or a duplex work. What we don't want to say is that the developers get to do whatever they want, but what we do want to say is that people who know what's needed can figure it out and get it right if they have the flexibility. Otherwise, they are building a wasteful amount that has snowballing costs for us all. And finally, just a couple of places where we suggest specific word choice and some wording to avoid. This reiterates a bunch of the recommendations that we've already spelled out, but a couple I'll call out. When we say eliminate parking mandates, people hear eliminate parking. They don't necessarily know what mandates means or what we're talking about, so we want to focus more on a positive solution, flexibility instead. When we do say parking mandates, we should always try to qualify them as wasteful and costly. As we pointed out, people don't perceive an oversupply of parking in the first place because they exist in their day-to-day by default in driver mode. They don't see oversupply in that mode as particularly a bad thing. So we really want to drive home the wastes and costs at every opportunity. And this tees up that the status quo is a problem to be fixed, bumping up our sort of urgency and relevancy for people. And as noted, flexibility and site-specific parking works with a really nice symmetry and sort of a internal logic with waste as the problem. I will call out that developers are not necessarily a sympathetic category. We want to shift with our wording, our examples, our stories, and our messengers to more personable characters. If you can make it local, talk about local contractors, local business people, property owners in the community. And finally, with some of the jargon like walkability, again, know your audience. For some of us, walkability is catnip, right? But a rule of thumb is that it's always better to use familiar terms and sort of show, don't tell. Describe or depict those places where it's inviting and convenient to walk. It's a lot to keep track of. There's some general themes that we keep hitting on here. The idea is to keep our wording focused on waste and flexibility and local people and places and our neighborhoods, and to move away from overly focusing on car-centric language that triggers defensiveness, and to move away from jargon that people aren't going to relate to. We don't have to be militant about any of this. Again, know your audience and adjust accordingly. But these are some of our findings from both elite, sort of influential audiences like lawmakers and community leaders, and also from general population voters. So with all that, I'm going to pass back to Jamal to walk through some more of the tested language from the research.
Thank you, Anna. And I really want to give Anna a huge amount of credit for helping pull together this messaging framework, and as well as her work to make these wins a reality in states like Washington and Montana. So thank you, Anna. And one thing I just wanted to highlight of what Anna just said is you know your audience. This messaging guidance is a toolkit, not a Bible. But what I can tell you, there are certain messages around parking that aren't in this presentation that will work with certain audiences. However, we do know that these messages work across a broad spectrum of folks, and that these are safe to use in pretty much any room you walk into. So I'm going to roll through some of the just top performing messages from the research. Next slide, please. These are messages survey respondents found convincing in the high 70s and 80s. These are ones that were found very convincing at the highest levels. You can see that, and this is reflective of the presentation we just gave, but waste is a very important message to use. They also do not know that these rules were made in the 50s and 60s for previous communities, and that they can be changed and are not serving today's needs. You can't operate in society without hearing about affordability nowadays in the news. A housing affordability message performs really well. And I think if we can take anything away from this, it's about people and places. We want to talk about the community we want to build, the places we want to build, and how that will support the people that we care about. And if we talk about it and centralizing that, and then talk about solutions and flexibility, we can win on this issue. Next slide. As mentioned earlier, the issues of local environmental effects tested very strongly. But it's very important, as Anna and I think Daniel said earlier, that it's not about global climate change. Not a lot of people even connect the burning of fossil fuels to global climate change, let alone parking reform, a parking policy in their community. But they do see how asphalt and parking can harm watersheds, harm stormwater, harm tree planting and the growth of trees in their community. All right, next slide. We need to emphasize community costs. We want to express costs in dollars and cents and higher rent and prices, but also in community costs and lost opportunities. Today's wasteful parking mandates often mean that communities can't have the kinds of shops, the mom and pop shops, the parks to walk their dog, or other amenities that they actually need. So we need to highlight specific, sympathetic stories about community services and characteristics that most people value, and describe these as Anna said earlier, use visuals. And as Anna mentioned, messages about cancel local daycare project is incredibly persuasive to folks. They don't see the need for a certain amount of parking stalls for a facility that's mostly going to be used to drop kids off. Next slide. Housing affordability. As mentioned earlier, it is not top of mind that parking mandates contribute to the housing shortage, but they do understand the messages that it will. So we have to connect the dots for them. And once we connect the dots for them, we need to emphasize more home choices that local workers can afford. Use that additional spot can add over $200 to monthly rent stat, whether it's used or not. And then we need to pivot to flexibility and talk about how this flexibility will create more home choices that our local workforce can afford. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about the methods used to build this research earlier, but it's all laid out there. It was pretty significant testing in September and October of last year, followed by some learned lessons from the state legislature this past legislative session, as well as further research that Anna and Sightline Institute did this summer, expanding upon that research, as well as some final randomized controlled trials done by Grow Progress in the last month to make sure that we synthesize the findings correctly. Next slide. And I think we're done here. So I just want to say, for any follow-up questions or other messaging needs, obviously you have the Parking Reform Network, but if you also would like some guidance on the housing work, Kara Watkins Chow, who leads the comms team, will drop her email in the chat if she already hasn't. But let's now open it up for questions. Maybe one of you guys can find the first one, because I just haven't been looking at the chat first, and then I will take over the asking of questions.
I am looking at the chat now because I hadn't been looking at it either. Um, oh, and I see a hand raised as well. Actually, well, Grace's iPad 25 has its the iPad's hand raised. Why don't we take that one, and then if somebody can have a chance to review what questions are in the chat while we do that, that would be great.
Okay. I'm a natural resources director for League of Women Voters, Los Angeles County and the beach cities. And we encounter the tree argument a lot by the ocean. However, trees aren't native here. And what the two rationales that people use for not building parking are one, we don't have enough water, and two, it would cut down trees. But the trees are like in direct competition with people for water because it's all imported. We are a coastal prairie. We've never had trees. And what people think is our natural environment is completely unnatural, just like an asphalt parking lot. How do I message that? I'm a scientist, and how do I message it to non-scientists that what they idealize is actually not natural?
That's not to make a pun, but that's even further down in the weeds. We got it may take us back to just sort of a know your audience kind of messaging response. Um, I bet that there is something analog to trees in your area that could be swapped in for that best testing sort of local environmental harms. Like maybe it's erosion or flooding or drought even could fit in there. And relate that back to the excessive overbuilt parking and the pavement, the paved spaces that causes. I would think of I would find a different trade-off and maybe not get too deep down into debating like the whether trees belong there or not. I don't know. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, I would just add also that it's also important not to go down a whack-a-mole strategy with NIMBYs or folks that aren't going to be amenable to any solution and will just bring up another issue. I think it's there. What we learned from the research is that there's a broad swath of people that are amenable to these solutions if we communicate it about in the way that we discussed today, and that the energy is better spent talking to that audience and those decision makers than the folks that are going to participate in the whack-a-mole program. I have another question. Thanks for Eris for raising. What about parking changes? Many of my local jurisdictions are revising their parking minimums downward, but when we're implementing road diets, increasing bicycle infrastructure, etc., there's usually a decrease in parking spots and people lose their minds, including some cyclists. What kind of messaging might be useful here? Is it street safety? Is it kids being able to ride to school? Um, just send that to the group.
I can take an initial stab at that question. I think part of the question here, like I think we would distinguish based on what is the context in which you are messaging on this and what's the audience and like where are you in the process. Um, a lot of the tips that we're presenting today are about bringing people on board who haven't thought that much about the issue, doing sort of mass communication aimed at the public, getting people out. So this would be kind of in advance of a decision. Um, can we get people to support this change? And I think a lot of the messages about really accentuating the trade-off, accentuating the community benefits, the vision of kids riding to school, I think that's a great thing. People are going to be compelled by that sort of thing when you can lay it out in terms of the actual atmosphere at the public hearing. And the specific thing you're talking about, and this kind of goes a little bit outside the scope, I think, of the messaging guide, but I will say one piece of advice that I've seen repeatedly and seen in practice work with something like we're going to take away some on-street parking to put in a bicycle facility is that people are going to scream about it at the public hearing. If you have the votes on your council to do it anyway, you're going to pass it and you're going to do it anyway. And the people who screamed about it 6 months later are going to be completely quiet about it. Um, And so one piece of kind of hard-nosed advice I've seen about if you have the political support to do something like that, um, ignore the people who are screaming. Let them scream, do it anyway. And they're usually going to find after the fact that they don't hate it as much as they thought they would hate it. And that is not a message that was in our guide. That's kind of for a different stage in the process, a different context. But I think that there is some truth to this, that people are wired for loss aversion. People are wired to worry about the what if of, oh my God, you're taking away parking spaces. What if we have gridlock? What if customers can't come to my business anymore? What if nobody can find parking? Um, Rather than tackle that what if head on and have the debate on those terms, frame the positive, bring in the persuadable with the positive vision of what we could have. Um, and you're not going to silence everybody who might scream and complain. You're just not.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I would, you know, what we in comms are always saying is pivot to back to your message, right? So you want to pivot back to that waste frame, to the current harms that status quo is causing. And then in this case, it sounds like you might also want to contrast to sort of forcing sprawling, like strip mall style development outside of those unique beloved downtown places, right? So you're kind of contrasting real local harms to forcing even more of the things that people don't want or like happening in the built environment.
Great. Joy has a question. How do we present these ideas in a zoning board, a hearing board full of people concerned about affordable housing being Section 8 or low-income housing? How do we talk about parking reform for communities that care deeply about affordable housing build-out?
Great question. I don't know, Daniel, if you want to start us off. I mean, I think that's a perfect place to use sort of the current harms and to really talk about the price that renters and the whole spectrum of the housing market pays when we overbuild parking. And there's ways to drill down on that, but that might be one case where you talk about when we're talking about subsidized income restricted housing, overbuilt parking makes that housing more expensive to construct as well and limits where and what can be added. And so there's a real coalition to be built from like the sort of anti-sprawl conservationist to the affordable housing provider advocate that we're in league to address affordability.
I'd actually like to clarify with Joy maybe the subtext of that question. Because there's two opposite versions in which you could read it. The people concerned about a lack of affordable housing and how do we enable that? Or is this people concerned that affordable housing will be low income housing and they're saying they don't want that in their community? Which are you referring to here? Because I think I read that question as the latter.
Oh yeah, maybe I misread that.
Feel free to unmute.
Okay, great. Thank you. My question was about the people who I think they killed an affordable housing unit that was going to be a part of some new construction. It was like an office to housing convert plan, and people were worried about the parking and they were going to lose their parking. And they were kind of just bringing up the mention of affordable housing, but they ended up changing it into is this going to be low income housing? And then a little later, it turned into, oh, well, this is Section 8 housing. It went from affordable housing to Section 8 to low income from the public commenters. And I think the loss and changing of the parking, or I think they thought there wasn't going to be enough parking, end-to-end parking. They didn't understand what that was going to entail. So I think that might have been killed. So it was really people who were concerned about um, affordable housing, and they assumed that it was going to be low income and Section 8 housing. That's what it was.
Yeah, so that it was parking was sort of weaponized in a way against a type of that type of housing.
Mm.
Yeah.
I suspect that there may be some useful guidance in sort of the companion piece to this, WNN's broader, housing messaging framework, about this issue here. But I mean, certainly, yeah, I think um, when parking is at issue, I think the key would be to steer again, as much as you can to try to steer the substance of the conversation to the benefits of housing flexibility. Oh, excuse me, of parking flexibility. Um, that this isn't about trying to engineer a certain kind of outcome for the community, but this is about allowing a range of things to be possible. I don't know how helpful that is in this context, but um, I will note here that we're over time, which, as the PRN person on the panel, I'm happy to continue answering a couple questions here. I don't know if my co-presenters can also stick around. And I see in the chat that Kara provided contact information. For those who would rather follow up after the fact, we'll get back to you. But
I can
yeah, as
hang
far as
around.
I'm concerned, we could take one or two more.
Yeah, why don't there's one in the chat, and then Linda has her hand up. So why don't we just decide to tackle those two more, and then call it a day, so we don't take up too much time.
Thank you.
Linda,
Thank
go
you.
ahead.
This is back to the affordable housing piece, which I'm very interested in for many reasons. I work in climate, so densification in general is great. But I'm wondering if there are any examples of affordable housing being built with an agreement um, that could be actually checked, i.e., do people have a registered vehicle or not? Um, and that those people would actually get preference. So they could move up on a list if they didn't have a car, and that could be for regular affordable housing or senior affordable housing. When that housing is built, close to public transport. So I'm just wondering, are there any examples of that out there? It's something I'm very interested in the idea of, because it, as you said, it does make the building of affordable housing significantly cheaper too.
I think I mean, the question, kind of does this exist out there is, a little bit beyond the scope of the research that we've done here for this. It's kind of I would suspect that yes, there are examples of agreements like that out there just because it's a big world. Um, in terms of messaging around a change to parking policy itself,
Mm,
um, one place I would pull this back to is, not that you should never have an affordable housing builder, create that kind of arrangement or that it would never be appropriate. But in terms of the policy argument, I would kind of reiterate that we found that it's not helpful to do things that even inadvertently turn the question of parking flexibility into a referendum on cars and driving. So
mm,
I know, and maybe Anna would want to say more about this. I mean, one thing that they found in their work, in their coalition work in Washington, advocating for statewide parking reform, was that it was better to not tie the proposal itself to proximity to public transit. Because as
mm,
soon as you do that, you're conveying parking reform is something that's appropriate only where people can ditch their car and rely on transit. And we actually shouldn't do this in places where that's not the case. So I'm worried there would be a similar pitfall in a
mm,
in a very local context in tying a parking reform proposal to this notion that oh, well, we can, it's okay to build low parking or no parking developments because we can vet whether people have cars when they get on the list for it. You are now having the debate about the merits of the parking policy itself
mm.
on this terrain where you don't want to be having it, where it is now a referendum on cars good or cars bad, or do we need
I
cars?
see.
Yeah.
Right.
I would just add, totally agree, and would add that one thing that flexibility policies tend to be written is that it untethers the unit from the mandated parking spots, right? And so a tenant then has an option to rent a unit that isn't encumbered already by default with that $200+ extra rent a month, right?
Mm.
So in our current status quo policy, and Daniel can correct me if I'm wrong, essentially that cost of parking is written into rent.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, almost everywhere that is the case. And even if the property owner isn't thinking of it consciously in that regard, the developer builds the building, they incur a construction cost, they take out a loan to pay that construction cost, and then they have to pay their construction loan back. And so, in a very real way, the money that was spent to build the parking is part of the property owner's costs now, and they are going to pass that on to the tenant. So, in the vast majority of situations, as a renter, you don't see your parking space as a line item. You don't see it in your lease or as a line item on your rent payment, but it is. You're paying for it. So yeah, what Anna's talking about in the policy world is sometimes called unbundling. There are a small but growing number of places that actually have built this into local law now. Seattle has an unbundling ordinance, though my understanding is it's kind of imperfect, that there are some critiques of it. But the idea is that new apartment buildings now um, are required to separate out the cost of the parking for the tenant. So you rent an apartment that doesn't come with a parking space, and then you separately rent a parking space in the building if you want to.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that might be the policy design answer to what you're after with your question. And then, we don't recommend opening with this kind of message, but Daniel and Parking Reform Network has used, I think, effective messaging or data about car ownership, right? And so by default, lower income tenants tend to own fewer cars. And so I think it is okay to get into that level, when you're in the next rounds of conversations, not the opening gambit, but talking about sort of the regressiveness essentially built into the mandate.
Interesting. That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, the way
And
in which we will highlight that, and this is again not for the opening kind of mass messaging,
right.
it's for the
No, I get
one-on-one
that.
conversation.
Mm-hmm.
The specific way in which we highlight that is we will pull from census data what percentage of households have 0 or 1 vehicles available.
Right.
Bundling that is really, really helpful because now you're not talking about car-free households who are usually a sliver. You're talking about a majority of renter households. It's a majority everywhere I've ever seen um, that have either 0 or 1 vehicle, and you can directly contrast that to a parking mandate that may be 1.5 or 2 parking stalls per apartment and point out the inherent inequity there.
Right. And there's an inherent absurdity to, like, oftentimes even studio apartments right downtown are required to have 1.5 or sometimes even 2 or more spots. So sometimes pointing out these sort of like wildly absurd or egregious examples that just don't fit is also a nice way to illustrate like the blanket formula it doesn't work when it's one size fits all, right? Like it very much has to do with the use, the type of housing, and the location and the site and what you're trying to do with that particular project.
Okay, thank you. I mean, the only problem I see with some piece of that is, yes, uncoupling the cost of the parking from the rent may make some people say, oh dear, I don't need a parking place, but not knowing who that would be going in when you build the building, you would still have to build, right? Parking for if everybody decides they want a parking. You know what I'm saying? So I'm not sure if that would actually work in reality.
Well, Linda, I think it's important to keep the North Star here, which is you care about climate. I think a lot of these folks in this call care about climate.
And affordable housing.
Absolutely. And I'm trying to work at the nexus of that. And I think that it's important to remember that taking on these parking mandates will lower vehicle miles traveled and have a huge impact on climate. But the most effective way of talking about it is this flexibility and waste park. And that flexibility will lead to more transit-oriented development like the housing you are talking about. Around transit and infill development, more homes tucked into existing neighborhoods. Anthony has a question. This will be our last question. How would you address the
Thank
issue
you.
of underground parking built in new housing projects in walkable neighborhoods? I think that parking maximums are a solution, but it's not the easiest policy to communicate in my experience.
A question, we did this for a different audience yesterday, and a question about parking maximums came up that I'm not sure we fully answered. I think, and some of these things are in the policy weeds, these are not the one-on-one level conversation. But that's a live issue in a lot of communities. At PRN, I will say that we do not strongly advocate for parking maximums. I mean, situationally, we'll entertain it. We'll have the conversation about it. But as a basic policy prescription, we don't, specifically because this message of flexibility is so compelling in bringing people on board with parking reform. The notion that the mandates are arbitrary and restrictive is really compelling. Um, and there's something about maximums that does undercut that for people. Because now you are stipulating an amount of parking that you think is appropriate. You're just doing it from the opposite direction. So I think that is a tough political circle to square. Um, and that doesn't mean that I'm never going to entertain, in a local context, an argument for parking maximums. Um, but yeah, it is difficult to square it with the messaging that we find broadly brings the general public on board with parking minimum reform.
Well, I think that's our last question. Daniel, do you want to close this out here?
Yeah, I would thank everyone for coming. I see some have already had to trickle out, and that's fine. But for those who stuck with us, hope that you found this content valuable. There have been a lot of links shared. You can find the messaging guidance that we shared on the Welcoming Neighbors Network website.